Panzerkommando und Bunker 6. Geben Sie Fliegeralarm. Der Feind fliegt Luftangriffe. Ist da jemand? Hallo? Ende. Wir schicken eine Patrouille zur Verstärkung. Ende. Hoffentlich haben Sie eine gute Entschuldigung. Verteilt euch! Feldwebel, übernehmen Sie mit 3 Männern die Flanke. Ich gebe Ihnen Feuerschutz.
Nein, nach unseren Informationen sind nur noch ein paar 100 übrig.
Gehen Sie in Abwehrstellung. Wir wissen, wie viele es sind.
Meine liebe Anna, I do not know if this letter will ever reach you. There is no proper post anymore, only men carrying papers west when they can, and most of those do not arrive. We were sent into Prague yesterday. It is not like the front we knew before. There are no clear lines here. The city is broken into pieces, and in each street it feels different. One block is quiet, the next is firing from every direction. They have built barricades everywhere, not proper military ones, but strong enough. Trams pushed across the road, stones torn up, furniture piled behind. When we came in, the first vehicle ahead of us was hit almost immediately. After that, we went forward on foot. You cannot see who is firing at you. It comes from windows, from cellars, from roofs. Sometimes you think the street is empty, and then suddenly it is not. We fire into buildings without knowing who is inside. It is not a good feeling, but there is no other way now. The air in the city is very heavy. Smoke and dust sit between the houses and do not move. By midday, your throat is dry and burning. We had no water for most of the day. One of the men tried to collect some from a broken pipe in a building, but it was dark and tasted of iron. We are not alone here. There are Luftwaffe men with rifles, police units, and others I do not recognize. Everyone looks the same now, tired, unshaven, carrying whatever weapon they still have. No one speaks much. Our officers say little as well. Orders come, but they are short and change quickly. Yesterday we were told to clear and hold a street. Today we are told to move again. It feels less like we are taking the city, more like we are passing through it. There are many civilians still here. Some watch from the windows, others run when the firing starts. I saw white cloths hanging from a few buildings today. Not everywhere, but enough that you notice. Still, the shooting continues even there. You must not worry if you do not hear from me again for some time. Things are very unclear now. There is talk that we will move further west soon. Everyone says something different. Americans, Russians, surrender, but no one knows for certain. I stay with the men from my group. That is what matters. As long as we are together, things feel more ordered, even here. At 2:41 in the morning on the 7th of May 1945, General Alfred Jodl signed Germany's unconditional surrender in a schoolhouse in Reims, France. On the Western Front, guns fell silent within hours. In Berlin, the last organised German resistance had already collapsed days earlier, the garrison having ceased to function as a coherent fighting force. Hitler had been dead for a week. In Prague, 350 kilometres to the southeast, Waffen SS armoured columns were still rolling toward the city. Artillery crews were still calculating firing coordinates for targets inside Czech neighbourhoods. Me-262 jet fighters were still receiving strike coordinates from SS headquarters. Resistance fighters who had already surrendered their weapons were being shot in railway station yards. Czech civilians were being forced at gunpoint to walk in front of advancing German infantry through streets lined with barricades they had built themselves. German commanders throughout Bohemia and Moravia were listening to radio broadcasts announcing the Reich's capitulation. A substantial portion of them had decided to keep fighting regardless. What followed over the next 4 days was fought between armies that had technically ceased to exist, under orders from a state that had legally dissolved for objectives that had shifted entirely from the military to the personal. The Waffen SS units still in action in and around Prague on the 9th, 10th and 11th of May were not fighting for Germany. Germany was gone. They were fighting because the alternative, Soviet captivity, represented for men who had worn the collar runes of the most politically compromised formations in the German military, a prospect most regarded as a death sentence. The Red Army's documented treatment of Waffen-SS prisoners across the Eastern Front over 4 years gave them specific and well-founded reasons to hold that view. The last shots of the Second World War in Europe were fired near a village called Slivice, 4 kilometers southeast of the town of Psybram, on the 12th of May. 4 days after the unconditional surrender. The forest was quiet by morning. No ceremony marked the moment. No one recorded the precise time. By the spring of 1945, the concentration of German military power in Bohemia and Moravia was, by the standards of a collapsing Wehrmacht, extraordinary. The Nazi leadership had been developing contingency plans for Czechoslovakia as a final redoubt since 1944. The terrain of western Czechoslovakia, predominantly mountainous, heavily forested, cut by river valleys that created natural defensive corridors, was suited to sustained defence against numerically superior forces. An army with adequate supply lines and access to the Bohemian highlands could hold ground long after equivalent formations on the open plains of northern Germany had been overrun. Alfred Jodl had ordered the local Nazi administration in Prague to convert key buildings throughout the Protectorate into fortified positions capable of housing a functioning government. The assumption embedded in those orders was explicit. If Berlin fell, the regime would relocate to Bohemia. By May 1945, that plan was no longer theoretical. Elements of the 6th SS Panzer Army had been pulled back into the region following the Ardennes failure and the fighting retreat through Hungary and Austria. The 1st and 4th Panzer Armies had significant forces present. The 7th, 8th and 17th Combined Armies all maintained formations in the area. Under Field Marshal Ferdinand Sherner, Army Group Center remained one of the largest intact German military groupings still in the field anywhere in Europe. Soviet operational records put the figure at approximately 900,000 German and Axis soldiers in or near Czechoslovakia at the time of the surrender. Sherner was central to everything that followed. He had built his military reputation on a single governing principle: absolute obedience, enforced through direct and immediate means. His military police operated with a latitude that distinguished them from equivalent units elsewhere in the Wehrmacht. Soldiers found away from their positions without written authorization were subject to summary execution. Hanged men were left at roadsides and crossroads with signs around their necks identifying them as cowards or deserters, placed there specifically to be seen by passing troops. He regarded these measures not as extreme, but as operationally necessary. In April 1945, Hitler promoted him to Field Marshal, the last officer to receive that rank in the Third Reich, and named him Commander-in-Chief of the army in his political testament. Sherner, in Hitler's view, was the man who would continue the fight. The civil administration of the Protectorate was embodied in Karl Hermann Frank, a Sudeten German politician who had made himself one of the most powerful and feared figures in occupied Czechoslovakia. Frank held the rank of SS Obergruppenführer and simultaneously occupied the civilian position of State Minister for Bohemia and Moravia. He had overseen the reprisal massacres at Lidice and Ležáky following the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich in 1942, destroying both villages entirely and shooting every adult male in Lidice. He understood the Czech population's accumulated hatred with precision, because he had spent 6 years generating the conditions for it. By late April 1945, Frank was aware his position was untenable. Multiple Soviet fronts were converging on Bohemia. The Prague civilian population, 6 years into an occupation marked by censorship, forced labour, mass executions and systematic cultural suppression, was visibly approaching open revolt. Between the 30th of April and the 1st of May, Frank announced on Prague radio that he would drown any uprising in a sea of blood. He stated it as a certainty, not a warning. He did not qualify it. The broadcast was intended to hold the Czech population in passivity long enough for an organised German military withdrawal to get underway. What Frank could not announce was that the military situation had already moved beyond his control. The Soviet 1st, 2nd and 4th Ukrainian fronts were converging on Bohemia from the north, east and southeast, a combined force of 2 million men. Stalin had made the capture of Prague a political priority of the First Order, not merely for its symbolic value, but for its implications for post-war Central European politics. Winston Churchill had reached the same conclusion from the opposite direction, pressing the American command to advance on Prague before the Soviets arrived. General Eisenhower declined, holding American forces at the agreed demarcation line in western Bohemia, approximately 70 kilometers from the city. The practical effect was that the only armies capable of relieving any uprising in Prague were Soviet, and they were still days away when the fighting started. At 12:33 on the 5th of May, 1945, Czech radio announcer Zdeněk Mančal had already broadcast that morning's famous opening. It is just 6 o'clock, but it was his afternoon call that ignited the city. The broadcast went out on the same frequency that the Protectorate had used for German programming for 6 years. Calling all Czechs, come to our help at once. Calling all Czechs. The message originated from inside the radio building at Vinohradska 12 in the Vinohrady district, where a group of Czech resistance fighters and police officers had been fighting SS guards since 1 o'clock in the morning. The SS presence inside the building had been substantial. Approximately 90 guards were posted at Vinohradska, 12 in the first days of May. The Nazi administration was aware that control of the airwaves could prove decisive in the event of an uprising, and had reinforced the garrison accordingly. The Czech radio staff had prepared for this. In the days before the uprising, they removed all directional signage from inside the building, so that SS guards would lose their bearings in its corridors. They hid in the broadcast studio through the night of the 4th into the 5th. When the fighting began at 1 o'clock in the morning, Czech policemen and resistance fighters attacked simultaneously from multiple entry points, using the SS guards' confusion about the building's layout against them. The lower 3 floors remained contested for hours. By midday, Czech fighters controlled the upper studios. The broadcasts continued uninterrupted through the morning. The 12:33 appeal went out, and Prague responded. Tens of thousands of civilians poured into the streets. Nazi road signs were ripped from walls. Czech flags appeared on buildings from which they had been banned for 6 years. German shop signs were painted over. Tram operators refused to accept Reichsmarks. Crowds of civilians, the majority of them young men with no military training, overwhelmed isolated German garrisons across the city and seized their weapons. By the end of the uprising's first day, the Czech resistance held most of Prague, including multiple broadcasting points, railway stations, and key bridges. A makeshift hospital was established in the basement of the old town hall. Throughout the night of the 5th into the 6th, tens of thousands of citizens worked in the dark, tearing up cobblestones, overturning vehicles, dragging tramcars and furniture and rubble into the streets. By morning, more than 1,600 separate barricades had been erected across the city. By the end of the uprising, the final count would reach 2,049. The Czech resistance was poorly equipped for what was coming. The 30,000 fighters who took to the streets in the uprising's first hours were armed primarily with weapons seized from German soldiers in those first chaotic hours, supplemented by small arms that had been smuggled into the city during the spring. The insurgents had 10 improvised armoured trains and approximately 10 ground combat vehicles. They had no anti-tank weapons, they had no artillery. Against a reinforced SS counterattack, the barricades alone could not hold. On the evening of the 5th, Pückler Berghaus issued his call for reinforcements. A battle group of 60 tanks and armoured vehicles was ordered from Milovic, 20 miles east of Prague. Kampfgruppe Wallenstein was mobilised from the SS training area at Benešov, 22 miles to the southeast. Elements of Das Reich were summoned from northern Bohemia. Through the first half of the night, the city remained tense but relatively quiet. Then, at 3 o'clock in the morning on the 6th of May, Czech fighters holding barricades in the southern districts of the city heard it, the low, guttural sound of armoured vehicle engines carrying in the night air from beyond the outskirts. It was a column of tanks. The first SS armoured units were moving toward Prague along the main approach roads from the south. Pückler Berghaus had already issued his operational order. Our attack begins at dawn. Swastikas are to be displayed on houses as visual markings for the Luftwaffe. We will use incendiary bombs. This nest of vipers will be exterminated. The objective was to break the uprising before the Soviet fronts could close the distance to the city. At 8:50 in the morning on the 6th of May, the Czech Military Council sent urgent orders to all barricade positions to build additional obstacles at every approach to the city centre. The instruction was followed, but the SS was already inside the outer districts. The Luftwaffe struck first. Pückler Berghaus had ordered the firebombing of Prague, though fuel shortages forced the attack to be scaled back from its originally planned scope. The first strike was made by 2 Messerschmitt Me-262A jet fighter bombers from elements of KG-51, operating from Ruzyně airfield on the western edge of the city. One of their targets was the radio building on Vinohradska Street. At 5:40 in the afternoon on the 6th, a 250-kilogram bomb struck the building and disabled the transmitter. The broadcasts that had sustained the uprising's morale since the previous morning went silent. 80 minutes later, Czech technicians resumed transmission from a secret location in the suburb of Strašnice, having laid telephone lines to a backup transmitter before the attack. The broadcast that returned to the air carried a message for anyone still fighting at a barricade. Our brothers, fellow fighters, Czechoslovak army, hold out, hold out. Every minute of resistance is our future victory, a victory which draws closer every moment. Machine guns and flamethrowers are being fired against us. We are defending the places from where we are talking to you now with rifles. The Germans continued to attack Vinohradska 12 for the remainder of the uprising, believing the Czechs were still broadcasting from inside. The Czechs had moved to St. Nicholas Church, broadcasting from the tower. On the ground, the SS ground assault was pressing through the barricade network. SS armoured units pushed into the city from multiple approach routes, using vehicles to force through obstacles that infantry alone could not have penetrated. The Czech fighters had no means of stopping armour. Wherever tanks made contact with a barricade position, the defenders were forced back. At approximately 10:30 in the morning, shooting resumed in the outer districts with greater intensity than the previous day. Czech fighter Sticha, holding a barricade in the city's southern sectors, later described the situation. "We swore that we would hold on and keep Prague free. There was an incredible resolve amongst our forces. But the determination of individuals counted for little against armoured vehicles. By early afternoon on the 6th, SS formations had broken through significant sections of the outer barricade network and were pressing toward the city centre. Groups of German tanks were moving through streets from which the civilian population had not yet been evacuated." Harald Bohemian, another fighter holding the barricades through those hours, described what followed. "It was no longer possible to hold our positions. The barricade we held at noon had to be abandoned hours later after 3 German tanks got behind it. That evening, we were on our last defence line. Flames were rising from buildings and streets the defenders had vacated. The SS had used Czech civilians as human shields during the advance in multiple documented instances, pushing groups of Czech men and women ahead of their vehicles to deter fire from resistance positions. Inhabitants of houses from which shots were fired at German forces were dragged out and shot on the spot. The old town hall took direct fire during the fighting on the 6th. A makeshift surgery had been established in its basement with 16 mattresses. Within hours of the fighting's intensification, more than 120 seriously wounded Czech fighters had been brought there. Czech General Karel Kutlvacher, commanding the Bartosz organization that served as the uprising's military coordinating body, issued orders throughout the day for additional barricade construction at all approaches to the city centre. The instruction was followed. Fresh positions went up in the hours between the initial SS breakthrough and darkness, slowing the German advance and forcing SS units to consolidate their gains rather than continue pushing inward. By the evening of the 6th, the situation had stabilised into something closer to a siege. SS formations holding the outer districts, the Czech resistance maintaining a corridor through the centre of the city toward the Vltava. Neither side had the resources to finish what it had started. Then the ROA arrived. The Russian Liberation Army, the KONR in its Russian designation, often referred to simply as the ROA, was a formation of Soviet military personnel who had, for a variety of reasons, agreed to serve under German command rather than remain in prisoner of war camps or continue fighting under a Soviet regime many of them had personal reasons to oppose. Its commander was General Sergei Bunyachenko, a former Red Army officer captured on the Eastern Front who had agreed to lead what the Germans designated the 1st Infantry Division of the Russian Liberation Army. Formerly numbered the 600th German Infantry Division, the army's nominal political head was General Andrei Vlasov, who had surrendered to the Germans in June 1942 and spent the following 2 years attempting to convince the Nazi leadership to equip and deploy a properly organised anti-communist Russian fighting force. The Third Reich had never trusted the formation, had equipped it inadequately, and had deployed it in the field only in the final months of the war when nothing remained to lose by the experiment. By the 1st of May 1945, Bunyachenko's division was moving through Bohemia without a coherent operational assignment. His men were aware, with precision, of what Soviet capture meant for them. Soviet law classified all personnel who had served in German uniform, regardless of the circumstances of their enlistment, as collaborators subject to the full weight of wartime Soviet military justice. Capture by the Red Army meant, at best, years in labour camps in Siberia or the Soviet Far East. At worst, it meant summary execution on the spot. Bunyachenko had been in contact with Czech resistance representatives for several days before the uprising began. His decision to commit his division to supporting Prague was not made out of any affinity for the Czech cause. It was made because it offered the only remaining possibility of reaching American lines before the Soviet fronts completed their encirclement of Bohemia, and because demonstrating active opposition to German forces in the final days of the war might, in some future negotiation, constitute evidence of anti-fascist credentials that could be used in an appeal for clemency. The 1st Battalion of the ROA entered Prague at midday on the 6th of May. Bunyachenko committed the division immediately. During its time in Prague, the ROA's 1st Division disarmed approximately 10,000 German soldiers. More importantly, it possessed the one category of weapon the Czech resistance entirely lacked: heavy weaponry, artillery, armoured vehicles, anti-tank guns, capabilities that could stop SS armour rather than merely slow it. Experts estimate that between 5,000 and 7,000 ROA soldiers participated in the fighting in Prague, with the divisional commander reporting 300 killed or wounded to the Czech National Council by the 7th of May alone. What the arrival of the ROA created on the streets of Prague was a spectacle without precedent in the European war. Men on both sides of the same battle were wearing the Iron Cross. Both sides were carrying German weapons. Many had served in the same formations at different points in the war. The KONR soldiers wore German pattern uniforms with ROA insignia sewn over the original markings, and they had mounted Czechoslovak flags on their vehicles. They were now fighting Waffen SS units alongside Czech civilians who had been building barricades from cobblestones 72 hours earlier. When SS relief columns attempted to reinforce the formations already inside the city by advancing along the southern approach roads, they found ROA units dug in on high ground overlooking the access routes. One engagement involved an SS column being stopped approximately 8 miles from the city centre by ROA forces firing from a hillside position. The SS made multiple assault attempts. Each was repulsed. The column was unable to link up with the formations it had been sent to reinforce and eventually withdrew. With their relief columns blocked and the ROA and Czech resistance closing from multiple directions inside the city, General Toussaint formally requested a ceasefire. He was blindfolded and escorted under guard to the Czech National Council headquarters. Negotiations ran for more than 4 hours. Toussaint offered to surrender the city, but asked that the garrison be allowed to march west and surrender to the Americans. The Czechs refused those terms. On the 7th of May 1945, while Jodl was signing the instruments of surrender at Reims, German forces in Prague launched the most intense attack of the entire uprising. It was the strongest German military action of the 5-day battle. Armoured and artillery units pushed simultaneously at multiple points in the barricade network. SS mechanised infantry advanced behind the armour using the same human shield tactics that had been documented throughout the previous day's fighting. The Luftwaffe conducted a renewed bombardment, the radio building on Vinohradska Street, barricade positions in the outer districts, and residential blocks where resistance activity had been reported all came under attack. Entire sections of the city that the Czech resistance had held for 2 days were taken back by SS assault in the course of a single morning. The ROA, reinforced and fighting alongside Czech units in the interior of the city, was able to hold significant portions of the core against the German advance. Their anti-tank capability made the difference in multiple engagements where Czech fighters alone had been forced back by armour. But the ROA men were fighting with one eye already on the western roads. They were aware that the Americans they were trying to reach were not going to wait indefinitely. An American reconnaissance patrol had met with an ROA officer earlier in the uprising and confirmed what the Czechs had not yet grasped. The demarcation line agreement meant the Third Army was not coming to Prague. That information, once it reached Bunyachenko, settled the question of how long the ROA could remain. That evening, word reached General Kutlwasser at the Czech Bartosz command that Germany had signed the unconditional surrender at Reims. He issued an immediate ceasefire order to all Czech forces. The order created immediate confusion across the barricade lines. Some resistance units stood down and began removing weapons from their positions. Others, unsure whether the message was genuine or a German deception, remained in place. Czech desertion from the barricade lines increased significantly in the hours that followed, as fighters, who had been sustaining the defence for 3 days, concluded that the war's end made further sacrifice unnecessary. SS commanders pressed the advantage through the evening of the 7th, exploiting the weakening of Czech positions at precisely the moment their own offensive momentum was greatest. On the morning of the 8th of May, German forces resumed operations. The Luftwaffe flew another bombing run. SS infantry, supported by armour, captured additional positions across the city and reached the Masaryk railway station, a strategic transit point for any organised westward movement. At the Masaryk station, following its capture by SS troops, approximately 50 surrendered resistance fighters and non-combatants were executed. These men had laid down their weapons following the ceasefire announcement. They were shot in the station after it fell. The figure of 50 appears in multiple sources and is considered reliable, though the actual number may have been higher. The executions at Masaryk station occurred on the 8th of May, 1945. Germany had surrendered the previous day. The men killed, they were not combatants who died in active fighting. They were prisoners. They were shot by Waffen SS troops who were, at that moment, legally subject to the terms of an unconditional surrender their government had already signed and transmitted to every command frequency in the European theatre. The ROA began its departure from Prague during the afternoon and evening of the 8th of May, moving south toward the American demarcation line. Most did not make it. The Red Army arrived in Prague on the 9th of May and swept up the majority of KONR personnel before they reached American custody. Vlasov himself was captured on the 12th of May near Pilsen. He was transported to Moscow and executed on the 1st of August 1946, following a closed military tribunal. Bunyachenko was executed at the same session. Ceasefire negotiations between Czech and German commanders produced an agreement by the evening of the 8th. Czech forces agreed to allow German military personnel to withdraw westward through Prague toward the American lines in western Bohemia. In exchange, German forces departing the city were required to surrender their weapons before crossing the agreed lines. The ceasefire formally took effect around midnight. By the early hours of the 9th of May, German formations were moving westward through the city in columns. The last organised German units departed Prague before dawn. Isolated Waffen SS positions throughout the city remained occupied by men who had either not received the ceasefire order, had received it and rejected it, or had concluded that surrender to Czech forces carried risks they were unwilling to accept. Some of these positions continued firing through the night of the 8th into the 9th. Fighting with isolated SS pockets that had been cut off from the westward withdrawal continued in the hours following the main German departure. At 4 o'clock in the morning on the 9th of May, elements of the Soviet First Ukrainian Front reached the suburbs of Prague. Their initial contact was with isolated SS units that had been prevented from withdrawing by Czech insurgent activity in the outer districts. The war in Prague was over. The pursuit had begun. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich entered its final days of the war as a fragmented formation. Its components were scattered across a wide area under different command arrangements, responding to increasingly incoherent orders from a disintegrating high command. The Deutschland Regiment was in the St. Pölten area of Austria, fighting American forces. The division's armoured and artillery elements had moved to the Dresden area and been committed to those operations. The Der Führer Regiment, the 4th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment, was in southern Czechoslovakia, near the town of Budweis. Its commander was SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Weidinger, a lieutenant colonel who had led the regiment since June 1944, when he had taken command on the Normandy coastline in the days following the D-Day landings. Weidinger had driven to Prague in late April to meet with Pückler Berghaus at the SS headquarters in the city. At that meeting, the senior officers of the Protectorate administration had assured him the city was calm. Weidinger drove back to his regiment in southern Czechoslovakia with no indication of what was about to happen. 3 days later, Der Führer received orders from Sherner's headquarters: march on Prague, open the road to the city, suppress the insurrection, make contact with General Toussaint and carry out whatever orders he might give. Weidinger assembled a battle group from the regiment's available elements and marched north toward Prague in the early hours of the 6th of May. The same morning, the Kampfgruppe Wallenstein armoured columns were moving toward the city from the south. On the morning of the 6th, with Germany's surrender still 24 hours away, Weidinger was awarded the swords to his Knight's Cross with oak leaves, the 150th officer in the Wehrmacht to receive that decoration. It was presented by Sepp Dietrich at 6th Panzer Army headquarters. Weidinger acknowledged it and resumed the march north. By the time the Führer elements reached the Prague area, the operational orders Weidinger had received from Sherner's headquarters had already become irrelevant. The battle for Prague was beyond any solution a single regiment could impose. The Soviet fronts were days away. The uprising had a civilian base too broad to suppress with the forces available. And the unconditional surrender was being signed in Reims, even as his columns moved through the Bohemian countryside. Weidinger's final mission was not what the operational orders had specified. Rather than committing to combat against the Czech uprising, the Führer focused on the evacuation of German civilians and wounded soldiers from the city, people who, if left in Prague when the Czech population's treatment of Germans began in earnest, faced a serious and documented risk of violent reprisal. The convoy assembled under the regiment's protection consisted primarily of women, children and soldiers, no longer capable of fighting. Weidinger ordered the regiment's weapons to be rendered unserviceable before being discarded. The column moved through the city and out toward the west. At approximately 10 o'clock on the morning of the 9th of May, Weidinger's battle group made contact with the 2nd US Infantry Division near the Bohemian town of Rokycany. The Führer regiment surrendered to the Americans. Its fighting life ended in a field in Bohemia, its last operational task not a combat engagement, but the extraction of civilians from a city that was already turning on its German population. Those elements of Das Reich that failed to reach American lines before Soviet and Czech partisan forces sealed the western withdrawal routes were captured or killed in the days that followed. The Deutschland Regiment, which had been fighting American forces in Austria and attempting its own westward movement, suffered heavily. Most of its members who fell into Soviet or Czech custody did not return. The division had produced 72 Knight's Cross holders during the war. the largest number of any formation in the entire Waffen SS. Of those men who ended the war in Soviet captivity, many were still in labour camps years later. A portion did not survive them. On the 7th of May, before the surrender was signed at Rams, Sherner issued the order that defined the final phase of the Prague offensive. All formations of Army Group Centre were directed to force their way westward, rather than remain in place to surrender to Soviet forces. The military logic was comprehensible to everyone who received it. Surrender to the Americans, while uncertain, was survivable for most soldiers. Surrender to the Soviets, for men who had served on the Eastern Front, and in particular for men who had worn the Waffen SS collar runes, was a different calculation entirely. Sherner's order gave official authorization to a movement that individual formations across Bohemia had already been planning independently for days. The order carried one complication that Sherner either did not address or chose to ignore. The formations attempting to move west were not moving through empty territory. They were moving through a protectorate whose Czech population had just spent 5 days in armed uprising against those same formations whose anger was acute, and who were actively attempting to block any withdrawal that would allow German soldiers to escape Soviet capture. Czech partisan groups and armed civilian formations established blocking positions along the main westward roads, attacked German columns at vulnerable points, cut communications lines, and engaged in sustained harassment that slowed or stopped the withdrawal in multiple sectors. German formations attempting to force through these positions responded in documented instances by executing civilians in surrounding villages. The killing of civilians along the withdrawal routes is thoroughly recorded in the Czech historical record. It was not incidental to the final phase, it was the method by which German units attempted to clear their route. The columns pressing westward in the days following the surrender were not, in the main, coherent military units operating under unified command. They were aggregations of soldiers from multiple formations, many intermixed, moving under ad hoc leadership, or none at all. Sherner himself had departed his Prague headquarters for Austria on the 9th of May. The same day he had ordered his men to fight their way to American lines. American forces located him in the Austrian mountains on the 18th of May and took him into custody. He was transferred to Soviet custody, tried in Moscow in 1952, convicted of war crimes and sentenced to 25 years imprisonment. He was returned to West Germany in 1955 after serving 6 years. Tried again in West Germany for the summary executions of German soldiers ordered during the war, he was convicted, imprisoned and released in 1963. He died in Munich in 1973. The total figure most commonly cited for the German forces attempting the westward breakthrough is approximately 900,000 men across Army Group Centre and elements of Army Group Ostmark. What percentage of that number actually reached American lines before Soviet encirclement was complete remains disputed, but it was a small fraction of the total. The majority were taken prisoner by Soviet forces. For those identified as Waffen SS on capture, the practical consequences of that identification in the chaos of a pursuit across Bohemia in the days following the surrender were not always administered through a judicial process. The Battle of Slivice was the last major military engagement of the Second World War in Europe, and it is among the least known. It took place on the 11th and 12th of May, 1945, in the wooded hill country between the villages of Melin, Slivice and Chmielice, in the Birdy Hills approximately 60 kilometers southwest of Prague. The war had been over for 3 and 4 days, respectively, when the fighting at Slivice occurred. On the 9th of May, the day Soviet forces entered Prague, and the day Pückler Berghaus signed the capitulation document in the city, a large formation of German troops reached the area around Melin, Slivice and Chmielice, near the agreed demarcation line between American and Soviet zones of operation. Among them were elements of Kampfgruppe Wallenstein and the 4th SS Panzergrenadier Regiment Der Führer. The soldiers were accompanied by fleeing German civilians, thousands of ethnic Germans from throughout the Protectorate, who had attached themselves to the military columns as their only possible protection during the westward movement. Pückler Berghaus, who had been commanding SS forces in the Protectorate since before the uprising began, was with this formation. He was the senior officer present. The demarcation line had been agreed at the highest Allied command level, and American forces were not moving east of it. German soldiers who reached the line and expected to surrender to the United States Army encountered American officers, who directed them to Soviet custody instead. After the 8th of May, American forces were returning to the Soviet side any soldiers attempting to cross. For Wehrmacht, personnel, this redirection was deeply unwelcome but survivable. For Waffen SS men, particularly for an SS commander of Pückler-Berghaus's seniority, who had overseen Waffen SS operations in occupied Soviet territory, it was a different calculation entirely. Pückler-Berghaus ordered the establishment of defensive lines. The formation, numbering approximately 6,000 to 7,000 men entrenched in the hills around Slivice and Chimelis, using whatever artillery, armoured vehicles and machine guns were still available, securing high ground against attack. Czech partisan units had been attacking German columns throughout the westward withdrawal, and they had been watching the Slivice formation since it arrived. The partisans controlled the surrounding villages and had established observation positions across the Birdy Hills. On the 9th and 10th of May, small partisan groups probed the German perimeter in the wooded terrain around Zharkov and adjacent areas, conducting ambushes with small arms. These actions disrupted German logistics and inflicted minor casualties, but the partisans lacked heavy weapons and coordinated support. The German response to partisan harassment had been consistent throughout the withdrawal. Reprisals against the local civilian population, captured fighters and civilians were executed. Villages along the withdrawal routes that were suspected of supporting partisan activity had been dealt with summarily. That pattern continued in the Bardy Hills. On the 11th of May, partisan groups led by Soviet officer Yevgeny Antonovich Olesensky, who had been parachuted into the area specifically to organize local resistance, attempted a direct assault on the German defensive positions. The attack was decimated. A few dozen partisans against 6,000 entrenched soldiers with artillery was never a viable engagement. Olesensky's men were thrown back with heavy casualties, having achieved nothing beyond demonstrating to the German commanders that the perimeter was under sustained pressure. That afternoon, Soviet army forces arrived, and the calculation changed entirely. The 104th Guards Rifle Division made contact with the German positions in the Birdy Hills on the afternoon of the 11th of May, and immediately began preparations for a full assault. The Soviet attack that followed was not the disorganized partisan probe that Olesensky's men had conducted in the morning. It opened with a heavy artillery and rocket bombardment. The bombardment was supported by the 4th Armored Division of the United States Third Army's 12th Corps, which directed its fire from positions on the American side of the demarcation line, an acknowledgement that the German formation at Slivice represented a military problem that could not be left unresolved simply because the war was officially over. Following the artillery preparation, troops from the 1st, 2nd and 4th Ukrainian fronts attacked the German defensive positions in the Birdy Hills. Through the night of the 11th into the 12th of May, the German defensive positions collapsed sector by sector under the Soviet assault. Some German units attempted to break through the encirclement to reach American lines. Others attempted to negotiate. The American forces at the demarcation line had no authority to accept Waffen SS surrender under the terms that were in force. Pückler-Berghaus sought American custody for himself. The American negotiators at the line refused to take him. At approximately 3 o'clock in the morning on the 12th of May, at the Rakovich Mill, Pückler-Berghaus signed the instrument of capitulation for the German formation at Slivice. The document was countersigned by American and Soviet representatives. The signature acknowledged that the last organized German military resistance on Czech soil had ended. Shortly after signing, Pückler-Berghaus shot himself. He had signed the uprising into motion with his dawn order of the 6th of May. He signed its last military chapter at a mill in the Birdy Hills at 3 in the morning on the 12th. He was found dead nearby. The American negotiators had refused to take him. He knew what awaited him in Soviet custody for the crimes committed under his command in occupied Soviet territory. Around 6,000 soldiers and a large number of vehicles were captured by Soviet forces. A portion of the formation, those who had reached the edges of the Birdy forest before encirclement was complete, attempted to escape deeper into the tree cover to the south and east. Czech partisan units immediately established systematic combing operations in the Birdy forest specifically to intercept these men. The operations that followed, during which Waffen SS soldiers who had escaped the Soviet capture were pursued through the forest, are documented in Czech partisan records and in the accounts of survivors. The executions that occurred during the forest clearing operations are not classified as battlefield deaths in the Czech historical record. The last shots of the Second World War in Europe were fired close to the Slivice settlement. The precise time is not recorded with certainty. It was the 12th of May, 1945. The war had been over for 4 days. The Prague Offensive, as Soviet operational records designate it, ran officially from the 6th to the 11th of May, 1945, though the fighting at Slivice extended 1 day beyond its formal end. The Soviet, Polish, Romanian and Czechoslovak forces that fought in it suffered more than 50,000 casualties between those dates, men killed and wounded in a war that had already officially concluded. Soviet records specifically put the cost of the Prague operation at over 11,000 killed, and more than 40,000 wounded from the Red Army alone. German prisoners taken by Soviet forces in Czechoslovakia reached approximately 900,000. Czechoslovak resistance fighters killed during the uprising numbered 1,694, with approximately the same number wounded. The civilian death toll during the uprising and the subsequent weeks of violence remains disputed among historians. It was substantial. The ROA soldiers who had fought in Prague and then attempted to flee westward suffered their own accounting. Of the estimated 5,000 to 7,000 who participated in the Prague fighting, the majority were swept up by Soviet forces before reaching American custody. Some 350 were killed during the fighting in the city itself. In a Prague cemetery, a mass grave holds 2 generals and 187 unknown soldiers of the Russian Liberation Army. Men who had defected from German service fought alongside Czech civilians to preserve the city from the worst of the SS assault, and died doing so. The Soviet Union classified every one of them as a traitor, regardless of what they had done in Prague. The ideological framework allowed no exceptions. The ROA's contribution to the preservation of Prague from destruction is not disputed by serious historians. Without Bunyachenko's anti-tank capability blocking the SS relief columns and engaging German armour inside the city, the Czech resistance, armed primarily with seized pistols and rifles with no means to stop a tank, could not have held the city centre against the weight of the Kampfgruppe Wallenstein assault. For 4 decades following the war, official Czechoslovak historiography under the communist government classified the ROA as collaborators and made no acknowledgement of their role in the uprising. That classification was not revised until after 1989. The political outcome of the Prague offensive was settled before the last German soldier was taken prisoner. Stalin had achieved what he had wanted from the beginning: the Soviet army's presence in Prague at the moment of the German surrender and the absence of American forces from the city. Before Berlin had even fallen, Stalin on the 1st of May had ordered the 1st Belarusian front to redeploy southward so that the 1st Ukrainian front could regroup and drive on Prague. The 2nd Ukrainian front received orders on the 2nd of May to drive on Prague from the southeast. The political intention behind the military operation was explicit: ensure a Soviet military presence in western Czechoslovakia when the Germans there finally surrendered, and deny that presence to the Americans. That presence established the conditions for post-war Czechoslovakia's political alignment with the Soviet bloc. Czech soldiers who had fought with the Western Allies during the war, the pilots who flew in the Battle of Britain, the infantry who served in North Africa, Italy and Normandy, returned to a country where their service had become politically inconvenient. The communist coup of February 1948 formalised an outcome that had been shaped in significant part by Eisenhower's decision not to advance to Prague in May 1945, and by Stalin's determination to get there first at whatever cost. Karl Hermann Frank was captured by American forces in May 1945, transferred to Czechoslovak custody, tried in Prague, convicted and publicly hanged in the courtyard of the Pankrak prison on the 22nd of May 1946. His execution was attended by members of the public. General Toussaint, the Wehrmacht commander in Prague who had attempted to negotiate a ceasefire and ultimately ordered German forces to comply with the surrender terms, was tried by a Czechoslovak court and convicted. His engagement with the Czech National Council during the ceasefire negotiations was acknowledged as a mitigating factor. He was released in 1947. Otto Weidinger was held at the Dachau internment camp administered by the US Army following Der Führer's surrender in western Bohemia. He was not tried for crimes related to the Prague operation. He was tried in France in connection with the Ordur-Seglan massacre of June 1944, in which his division had been involved, and was acquitted in 1951. He subsequently became active in HYAG, the West German Veterans Organization for former Waffen SS members, and in that capacity produced a series of regimental and divisional histories that formed part of the post-war Waffen SS commemorative literature. He died in Aalen, Baden-Württemberg, in January 1990. The veterans of the 20th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, the 1st Estonian, a formation of Baltic volunteers conscripted from an occupied nation who had laid down their weapons in compliance with the ceasefire terms, used a specific phrase in their post-war accounts to describe the weeks that followed their surrender to Czech forces. They called it the Czech Hell. The phrase was not applied to a single incident, but to a sustained period that occurred as German soldiers and ethnic German civilians moved through the Czech countryside or were held in improvised detention facilities. The Estonians were not the most politically compromised of the Waffen SS formations. That distinction carried no weight in the weeks following the German surrender. Czech partisans resumed hostilities against fleeing German troops regardless of their intentions or nationality. The collar runes were the only identification that mattered. The broader fate of the ethnic German civilian population of Bohemia and Moravia, the Beneš decrees, the expulsions, the violence that preceded the formal legal processes, falls outside the scope of this account. But it cannot be entirely separated from what happened in Prague in May 1945, the accumulated violence of 6 years of German occupation discharged in the period immediately following liberation. Frank's sea of blood materialized. It simply ran in the opposite direction to the one he had intended. The Waffen-SS formations that fought in Prague in those final days were not a uniform entity. Kampfgruppe Wallenstein executed prisoners at Maastricht Station after Germany had surrendered, used Czech civilians as human shields, and killed villagers along the withdrawal routes during the westward flight. The Führer Regiment spent the final days of the war extracting civilians from a burning city and surrendered to the Americans in compliance with the terms it was given. The historical record does not distinguish cleanly between them, nor does the collective designation under which they served, which is what the Soviets, the Czechs, and the post-war tribunals used as their primary organizing principle when determining who faced what consequences. The men who died at Slivice on the 12th of May died 4 days after their government had surrendered. Their state had ceased to exist, and every legal framework that had once governed their service had dissolved. The forest at Slivice was quiet by morning. No ceremony marked the moment, no one recorded the time. Ferdinand Sherner, the man who had ordered his men to fight westward and who had fled Prague for Austria on the 9th of May, while that order was still being executed in the Body Hills, was located by American forces on the 18th of May and taken into custody. He was transferred to Soviet custody, tried in Moscow in 1952, convicted of war crimes, and sentenced to 25 years imprisonment. He served 6 years before being returned to West Germany in 1955, tried again in West Germany for the summary executions of German soldiers carried out under his command during the war. The hanged men at roadsides across the Eastern Front with signs around their necks. He was convicted, imprisoned, and released in 1963. He died in Munich in 1973. The soldiers he had ordered to fight their way west and then abandoned to their fate had been dead, or in Soviet captivity for years before he walked free. Andrei Vlasov and Sergei Bunyachenko were executed in Moscow on the 1st of August 1946 following a closed military tribunal. The mass grave in the Prague cemetery that holds 187 unknown soldiers of the Russian Liberation Army has no individual markers. The names of most of the men buried there remain unrecorded.